The air in my study on Beacon Hill has a particular quality. It's the scent of old leather, lemon oil on mahogany, and the dry, reassuring whisper of books that have outlived their authors. For 30 years, this room has been my sanctuary, my fortress of logic. A place where chaos is tamed by precedent and emotion is distilled into actionable strategy. It is where the Hale dynasty was not just managed, but fortified, brick by legal brick. Tonight, that fortress was about to be leveled by a single sheet of cream-colored cardstock. The envelope lay on my desk, stark white against the dark, polished wood. It had no return address, just a courier stamp from a private lab in Cambridge. It felt heavier than it should, as if weighted with the unspoken. I had commissioned its contents myself, an act of due diligence that felt more like a betrayal. A last resort, a prayer I wouldn't need an answer to. For a man who has built a life on verifiable facts, I had been living in a fog of willful ignorance for months, maybe years. I saw the signs. The way my wife, Eleanor, looked at our son, William. The suffocating, proprietary nature of her affection that went far beyond a mother's love. I saw the desperation in the eyes of William as young wife Amelia, a girl slowly being erased from her own family. I saw it all, and I filed it away under a convenient, comfortable label, maternal jealousy. It was a diagnosis that required no action from me. It allowed me to remain above the fray, the stoic patriarch overseeing a minor domestic squall. But then came the whispers in the dark, a phone call I wasn't meant to hear. Eleanor, in her own study down the hall, her voice a raw, broken thing I hadn't heard in decades, talking to her therapist. Snippets of sentences, sharp as broken glass, cut through the silence of our grand, empty house. This mistake. It looks at me with his eyes now. A bond that should never have been forged. How can I be his mother when I am also? Her voice dissolved into a sob, and I retreated back into the shadows of the hallway, a cold dread coiling in my gut. The words she didn't say hung in the air, monstrous and unthinkable. That was 3 days ago. 24 hours to secure a sample, a pacifier from my grandson Leo, his crib, a few strands of hair from William's brush left in the guest bathroom. Another 48 hours for the lab to process the truth. Now, here it was, the verdict. My hand was steady as I picked up the silver letter opener, a gift from my partners upon making senior counsel. I slit the envelope with a clean, surgical precision. The paper inside was thick, expensive, the kind of paper used for wedding invitations or death certificates. Appropriate, I suppose. The text was clinical, a series of headings and numbers. Subject A, William Hale. Subject B, Leo Hale. Subject C, Eleanor Hale. My eyes scanned past the technical jargon, the talk of allelic patterns and genetic markers, searching for the conclusion. I found it at the bottom of the page, a paragraph of dense scientific prose that my legal mind, trained to dissect the most convoluted language, struggled to comprehend. Not because it was complex, but because it was impossible. Then, a summary table designed for a layman. It presented the findings in brutal simplicity. Probability of paternal link between William Hale and Leo Hale, 99.9999%, that was expected. My son was the father. I read the next line. Probability of Eleanor Hale being the maternal grandmother of Leo Hale, 99.9999%, and then the third line. The line I had paid a small fortune to both see and never see. The line that took a lifetime of order and shattered it into a million pieces. Analysis of shared X chromosomal data indicates a 999% probability that Eleanor Hale is also the biological mother of Leo Hale. My breath caught in my throat. I read it again, and a third time. The words didn't change. They stared back at me from the page, cold and absolute. Paper doesn't lie. Numbers don't have agendas. This wasn't a domestic squall. It was a genetic abomination nestled in the heart of my home. My wife had slept with my son. Our grandson was also our son. My son was his own child's brother. The mahogany desk felt like it was dissolving under my hands. The leather-bound books on the shelves seemed to mock me, their spines standing in straight, orderly lines, while my world spiraled into utter madness. There was no precedent for this, no legal framework, no strategy in the well-worn playbooks of corporate or family law. I felt nothing. Not rage, not grief, not disgust. Not yet. All emotion was incinerated in a blast of pure, white-hot clarity. The fog was gone. The willful ignorance, the comfortable labels, all of it ash. I saw the past with terrifying precision. Every strange glance, every stifling embrace, every whispered word. It was a conspiracy not of malice, but of a sickness so profound it had poisoned the very blood in our veins. I carefully folded the report and placed it back in its envelope. I slid it into the top drawer of my desk and locked it. The click of the lock was the sound of a door closing on the man I used to be. The husband of Eleanor Hale, the father of William Hale, the world-weary but ultimately benevolent patriarch. That man was gone. In his place stood something else. Something colder, sharper, something forged in the crucible of this monstrous revelation. In that moment, I ceased to be a husband and a father. I became the prosecutor in the most important case of my life. And the defendants were my wife and my son. With the truth locked in my desk drawer, the past was no longer a collection of memories. It was a crime scene, and I, the lead investigator, was forced to walk back through it, dusting for the fingerprints of a pathology I had willfully ignored. Every family has its dysfunctions, its gentle madnesses. I had always told myself the Hales were no different. I had mistaken a malignant tumor for a common mole. It began, as so many of these things do, with a wedding. Amelia was a lovely girl. Bright, warm, from a perfectly respectable family, whose money, though newer and less storied than ours, was just as green. She adored William, and in her presence, I saw flickers of the boy he might have been without the crushing weight of his mother's attention. I was pleased with the match. Eleanor was not. She never said it, of course. Eleanor's objections were never voiced. They were enacted. She co-opted the wedding planning with the quiet, ruthless efficiency of a corporate takeover. Amelia had dreamed of a small ceremony in a vineyard in Napa. She ended up with a 300-guest affair in the grand ballroom of our country club, an event Eleanor referred to as suitably representing the joining of our families. The bride's opinion was a footnote. I remember watching Amelia in a Beacon Hill bridal salon. She was standing in a simple, elegant gown she had fallen in love with. Eleanor circled her like a shark, her lips a thin, disapproving line. "It's nice, dear," she'd said, the word nice delivered like an insult. "But the Hale women have always worn lace. It signifies heritage." An hour later, a bewildered Amelia was being fitted for a monstrosity of silk and antique lace that looked more like a shroud than a wedding dress. William stood by, shifting his weight from foot to foot. His only contribution a mumbled, "Mom knows best." I saw a young woman's spirit being systematically dismantled, and I called it a mother-in-law being hands-on. Exhibit A in the case of my own criminal negligence. Then came the house. A wedding gift, Eleanor had called it. A magnificent colonial, stone's throw from our own. It shared a back lawn. It was less a gift and more of a leash. "So you won't have to worry about a thing," she had chirped, handing them the keys. What she meant was, "So I will never have to be more than 30 seconds away." She had her own key. Would come home from the office to find her car in their driveway. She'd be in their kitchen, rearranging the pantry, or in their living room, critiquing the placement of their furniture. "Just helping the kids settle in," she'd say to me with a brilliant smile. William saw it as doting. Amelia saw it as a siege. But she was too polite, too intimidated to say anything. She would just stand in her own home, a guest at the mercy of her benefactor. I saw it, I registered the breach of privacy, and I told myself Eleanor was simply struggling to let go. The pregnancy was the turning point. The moment the obsession went from merely suffocating to pathologically territorial. When William and Amelia announced it over dinner, I felt a surge of genuine joy, a new generation, a future for the Hale name. Eleanor's reaction was different. She didn't smile. A strange, calculating stillness came over her. It was the look of a grandmaster seeing the entire board change with a single, unexpected move. From that moment on, Amelia ceased to be a person. She was a vessel. Eleanor dictated her diet, scheduled her appointments with an obstetrician of her choosing, and redecorated the new house's second bedroom into a nursery. Not their house. Our house. "The air is better up here on the hill," she explained, as if they lived in a tenement. "And I'll be right there to help with the night feedings." The assumption was absolute. The baby would belong to her. The birth of Leo was not a celebration. It was an extraction. I was there at the hospital. I saw Eleanor sweep past Amelia's own tearful mother to be the first one to the viewing window. I saw the look on her face as she held Leo for the first time. It was not a grandmother's gentle wonder. It was a raw, primal look of possession. A dragon reclaiming its hoard. Within a week, the fiction of William and Amelia's life together was completely shattered. Citing Amelia as exhaustion and obvious signs of postpartum anxiety, Eleanor moved Leo into the nursery in our home. "Just for a little while, darling," she cooed at a pale, hollowed-out Amelia, "until you get your strength back." William, my son, a man with a law degree from Harvard, stood by and sanctioned it. He parroted his mother's concerns, telling Amelia she needed to rest, that Mom knew what was best for the baby. He was her accomplice, a willing hostage. That was the last time I allowed myself the comfort of a lie. I stood in the doorway of our library that evening and saw Amelia staring out the window, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she wasn't drinking. Tears streamed silently down her face. She was a ghost in our house, while her child slept down the hall in another woman's arms. The scene was wrong, fundamentally, obscenely wrong. Yet I did nothing. I retreated to my study, poured a scotch, and told myself it was a delicate matter, a women's affair that would resolve itself. Now, sitting here in the same study, the memory is an acid in my gut. It wasn't a women's affair. It was the methodical, calculated theft of a child from his mother, orchestrated by my wife and enabled by my son. And I, Richard Hale, The man who could command boardrooms and bend judges to his will had stood by and watched it happen. The chronicle of their obsession was also the chronicle of my failure, but no more. The review of the evidence was complete. The time for observation was over. The time for judgment had begun. Sleep had become a foreign country. For 2 nights after witnessing Amelia, silent tears, I found myself adrift in the dark, my mind a relentless engine of cross-examination. I would lie in the king-sized bed, the space between Eleanor and me a cold, vast expanse, and listen to the house settle. The groan of old timber, the hum of the sub-zero refrigerator in the kitchen. Sounds that once meant comfort now felt like the restless murmurs of a deeply sick patient. It was nearly 2 a.m. when I finally gave up the pretense of rest. I slipped out of bed, careful not to disturb Eleanor, and padded barefoot down the carpeted hallway. The house was a museum of our life. Every portrait and piece of silver a testament to a carefully constructed narrative. A narrative that now felt like a forgery. As I passed Eleanor's study, I saw it, a thin blade of light slicing the darkness from beneath the door. And I heard a voice. Hers. Not the composed, melodic voice she used in public, but the same fractured, desperate tone I'd overheard before. Instinct, sharpened by a lifetime of depositions, took over. I didn't hesitate. I moved to the wall beside the door, placing my ear against the cool plaster, my body hidden in the shadows of a grandfather clock that had ticked away my family secrets for a century. She was on the phone, her voice a low, urgent murmur. I know the session isn't until Tuesday, Dr. Albright, but I can't stop seeing it. A pause, a shaky, indrawn breath. It's his eyes, William's eyes. When Leo looks at me, it's like he's accusing me, like he knows. My blood ran cold. The grandfather clock beside me ticked, each second a hammer blow against the mounting silence. No, it's not just new grandmother anxiety, she snapped, a flicker of her old imperiousness breaking through the despair. Then her voice crumbled again. It is the bond. The one we forged. I told myself it was to protect him, to keep him close, to make sure he would never be weak like his father, like Richard. The mention of my name was a physical jolt, as if she struck me from across the room. I was not just an outsider to her pain. I was part of the justification for her madness. It was a mistake, she whispered, the words barely audible. A terrible, unforgivable mistake. I was supposed to be his fortress, and instead, I became his cage. The only person he could truly connect with. And now that connection has a face. It has his face. William's face. The room began to tilt. The ornate patterns on the hallway runner swam before my eyes. I pressed my hand against the wall to steady myself. My mind, that precise and orderly instrument, was screaming. It was searching for an alternate theory, a less monstrous explanation, a metaphor, a delusion, anything but the literal, hideous truth that was beginning to form in the darkness of my thoughts. How can I be a mother to him? Eleanor sobbed into the phone, her voice finally breaking completely. How can I be a mother to William's son when I am also his mother? Click. It was the sound of a lock turning in my mind, the last piece of an impossible puzzle snapping into place. All the evidence I had dismissed, all the oddities I had explained away, the pathological jealousy, the territorial obsession with the baby, William's cowed, haunted demeanor, it all coalesced into a single, cohesive, and abominable image. A wave of nausea washed over me. I backed away from the door, my movements stiff and robotic, and retreated into the darkness of the main staircase. I sank down onto the steps, my head in my hands, the plush carpet cold against my bare feet. The word was incest. It was a medieval word, a Gothic word, a word for ruined royal houses and squalid backwoods tragedies. It was not a word for the Hales of Beacon Hill. It was not a word for my wife, a trustee of the Boston Symphony Orchestra. It was not a word for my son, a graduate of Harvard Law. And yet, it was the only word that fit. For a long time, I just sat there in the dark, the silence of the house pressing in on me. The prosecutor in my head was silent, stunned by the nature of the crime. The husband and father were dead. All that was left was a man staring into an abyss that had opened up in the center of his own home. Slowly, a new feeling pushed through the shock, resolve. Cold, hard, and absolute. I would not confront her. I would not confront him. Emotion was a liability. Accusations without irrefutable proof were just noise. I needed something tangible, something scientific, something that could not be denied or explained away by the twisted logic of a sick mind. I rose from the stairs. My movements were now filled with a grim purpose. I was no longer a ghost haunting my own home. I was an operative on a mission. First, I went to the nursery. The room was bathed in the soft glow of a nightlight shaped like a moon. Leo was asleep in his crib, his small chest rising and falling in a rhythm of perfect innocence. On the changing table beside the crib lay his pacifier. I took a sterile evidence bag from a box I kept for case files in my study, carefully picked up the pacifier with a pair of tweezers from my grooming kit, and sealed it inside. Next, I went to the guest suite where William and Amelia were staying, or rather, where Amelia was staying, and William occasionally slept when he wasn't being summoned by his mother. On the antique vanity, next to Amelia's things, lay a silver-backed hairbrush. William S. I plucked 3 strands of his dark hair from the bristles and sealed them in a second bag. Back in my study, I placed the 2 small bags on my desk. Evidence. Exhibits A and B. I looked up the number for the most discreet, high-end DNA lab in the state. I would have a courier pick up the samples in the morning, sending them under a paralegal's name from the firm. No traces could lead back to me. Not yet. As the first hints of dawn began to gray the Boston skyline, I sat in my leather chair, the evidence before me. I wasn't praying for an exoneration. I was preparing for a conviction. Armed with the terrible certainty of the DNA report, I began to move through my own house like a ghost, an observer in a life that was no longer mine. The knowledge didn't scream. It hummed, a low, constant frequency beneath the surface of every interaction. It changed the very quality of the light, casting familiar scenes in a harsh, forensic glare. My world had been placed under a microscope, and every glance, every gesture, every spoken word was now a specimen to be analyzed. I saw things I had been blind to before. The way Eleanor spoke to William was the most damning. It wasn't maternal. There was none of the easy warmth or gentle authority of a mother to her son. It was the language of a possessive lover, coded in the vernacular of family. When he came into a room, her eyes would track him, a flicker of something proprietary and deeply unsettling in her gaze. She would straighten his tie, brush an imaginary piece of lint from his shoulder, her touch lingering a moment too long. The gestures seemed innocuous to an outsider, but now I saw them for what they were, acts of ownership. One evening, Amelia, in a rare moment of courage, mentioned a friend's christening in Connecticut they had been invited to. "We were thinking of going," she said, her voice small. "Maybe stay the weekend. It would be our first trip, with Leo." Eleanor, who was bouncing the baby on her knee, didn't even look at Amelia. Her eyes were fixed on William. "Oh, I don't think that's a good idea, darling," she said, her tone syrupy sweet. "Leo's routine is so delicate, and I've been looking so tired lately, William. All that travel would be draining." I watched my son. I saw the brief flicker of desire for freedom in his eyes, a man yearning for a weekend away with his wife and child. And then I saw it extinguished by the force of his mother's will. He deflated, his shoulders slumping. "Mom's right," he mumbled, not meeting Amelia's wounded gaze. "It's probably too much for Leo." Eleanor smiled, a small, triumphant curve of her lips. She had won. She always won. It wasn't a discussion. It was a command cloaked as a concern. William was not her son. He was her subject. And his behavior, seen through this new lens, was that of a man living in a perpetual state of captivity. He was jumpy, constantly seeking his mother's approval for the smallest things. He avoided physical contact with both women. When Amelia would reach for his hand, he would pull away reflexively, as if burned. When Eleanor would touch his arm, he would flinch, a barely perceptible tightening of his muscles. He was a man trapped between his keeper and the woman who represented a freedom he was too terrified to claim. He was a prisoner of a war he had lost before it even began. But the most excruciating part of my surveillance was watching Eleanor with Leo. Her obsession with the child was absolute. She treated him not as her grandson, but as a second chance, a do-over. She would hold him for hours, whispering to him in a low, crooning voice, her face buried in his soft hair. At first, I had thought it was the doting of a grandmother. Now it looked like a confession. As if she was trying to pour all the twisted love she had for the father into the son, hoping to purify it through the vessel of his innocence. One afternoon, I came upon them in the sunroom. Eleanor was sitting in a rocking chair, Leo asleep in her arms. Amelia was standing in the doorway, a look of profound loneliness on her face. "He's got your chin, Eleanor," Amelia offered, a desperate attempt to be included in the moment. Eleanor looked up, and her smile was brittle, condescending. "He has the hale chin, dear," she corrected gently. "That's a very strong trait in our family." The subtext was clear. Our family. You are not a part of this. Amelia withered under the casual cruelty of the remark. She gave a small, defeated nod and retreated down the hall. Eleanor didn't even watch her go. Her entire universe was the small, sleeping child in her arms. She leaned down and kissed his forehead, a long, lingering kiss that made my stomach clench. In that moment, watching my wife hold the child of her own incestuous union, I felt a surge of something colder and harder than rage. It was the detached, clinical fury of a surgeon identifying a cancer. This wasn't a family to be mended. It was a malignancy to be excised. Cleanly, precisely, and without emotion. My observation period was over. I had seen enough. The diagnosis was confirmed not just by the lab report in my desk, but by the living, breathing evidence in my home. Every day I waited was another day of psychological torture for Amelia, and another day the poison seeped deeper into the foundations of all our lives. The time for quiet observation had passed. It was time to start building my case. It was time to sharpen the scalpels. The Hale and Graves law offices occupy the top 2 floors of a glass and steel tower overlooking Boston Harbor. It's a world away from the old money brick of my Beacon Hill home. Here, everything is sharp angles, cool tones, and the quiet hum of immense, controlled power. My office is a corner suite, a minimalist space designed for clarity, not comfort. It was the perfect venue for what I had planned. I summoned William with a curt, formal email, the kind I send to junior associates, requesting a meeting to discuss the administration of his trust fund. It was a plausible pretext, a matter-of-fact piece of family business that wouldn't raise suspicion. He replied within minutes, "Of course, Father. What time works for you?" The deference was automatic, ingrained. He arrived at precisely 4 p.m., looking out of place in his weekend khakis and a polo shirt. He looked like a boy playing dress-up in a world of men. He fidgeted with the leather strap of his watch as he sat in the Eames chair opposite my desk, a chair usually reserved for hostile CEOs or opposing counsel. I didn't offer him a drink. I didn't engage in pleasantries. I let the silence stretch, a tactic I de-perfected over decades in negotiation. Let the other side fill the void. Let them reveal their weaknesses. "Everything all right, Father?" he finally asked, his voice thin. I steepled my fingers and looked at him, not as a father, but as a cross-examiner. My gaze was level, my expression unreadable. "I wanted to discuss your future, William, and by extension the future of this family." He shifted in his seat. "The trust. Is there an issue?" "The trust is a financial instrument, William. I'm talking about something more fundamental. I'm talking about your role as a husband, as a father." A bead of sweat trickled down his temple. I don't understand." "Don't you?" My voice was quiet, devoid of accusation, which made it all the more menacing. "Tell me about your marriage. Are you happy?" The question caught him off guard. It was personal, intimate, and entirely outside the normal bounds of our relationship. "Of course. Amelia is. She's wonderful." "Is she?" I leaned forward slightly. "Because from my perspective, she looks like a prisoner of war, and you, her husband, appear to be acting as her warden. Or perhaps, more accurately, the warden's trusted deputy." His face paled. "That's not fair. Mom is just, helping. Amelia's been having a hard time since Leo was born. She's fragile." Fragile. I let the word hang in the air. Or is she being systematically isolated and undermined by a woman who refuses to relinquish control over you? A woman who has convinced you that your wife's natural maternal instincts are a form of mental illness. He flinched as if ID struck him. Mom loves Leo. She just wants what's best for him. Does she? Or does she want what's best for herself? I kept my tone even, surgical. I wasn't prosecuting him for the real crime yet. I was prosecuting him for the lesser charge of cowardice. I needed to see if he had a spine at all before I tried to break it. A man, William, protects his wife. He builds a life with her. He doesn't allow his mother to annex his home, his marriage, and his child. He doesn't stand by silently, while the woman he vowed to cherish is treated like an incompetent nanny. He stared at his hands, his knuckles white. He was trapped. To defend his mother was to admit his weakness. To defend his wife was to defy the single most powerful force in his life. "It's complicated," he whispered. "No, it's not," I replied, my voice like ice. "It is the simplest equation in the world. You are a husband and a father first. Everything else is secondary. A man who fails to understand that is not a man at all. He is a boy, and this firm, this family, this legacy will not be passed down to a boy. That was the knife, the threat to his inheritance, the one thing perhaps that could penetrate the thick fog of his mother's influence. His head snapped up, his eyes wide with panic. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that your current course of action is unacceptable. It demonstrates a profound lack of judgment, character, and moral fortitude, qualities essential for anyone bearing the Hale name." I paused, letting the weight of my words settle. "You need to decide, William. Are you Amelia's husband, or are you your mother's son? Because it's become painfully clear you cannot be both." He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He just looked at me, his expression a mixture of terror and a strange, pathetic plea for help. I saw no defiance in him, no outrage at my accusations. I saw only the confirmation of his guilt. He didn't confess to the unthinkable because I hadn't accused him of it, but his panic, his sweat-soaked submission, was a confession to everything else: his weakness, his complicity, his complete and utter failure as a man. He was not a monster. He was something far more pathetic, a vessel, a weak-willed, broken creature who had allowed something monstrous to happen through him. He was a victim, yes, but he was also an accomplice. And in the cold calculus of the law, that was more than enough to convict. "This meeting is over," I said, leaning back in my chair. "I suggest you go home and consider what I've said. Your future depends on it." He practically fled my office. I watched him go, feeling no pity, only a grim sense of confirmation. The son was broken, a casualty who would have to be managed. My focus now shifted. To understand the architect of this destruction, I had to understand her foundation. I had to dig into Eleanor's past. To understand a crime, you must first understand the perpetrator. Eleanor, my wife of 35 years, was now a stranger to me, the architect of a reality I couldn't comprehend. I needed to know how the elegant, controlled woman I married had mutated into this monster of possessive love. My marriage was not a source of information. It had been a carefully curated performance. I needed to go back, to excavate the years before me, to find the fault lines in her foundation. My work began not with investigators, but with the quiet, dusty archives of Boston's elite. The Hales were old money, but the Prestons, Eleanor's family, were something else. They were Brahmin to the core, a lineage tracing back to the Mayflower. With a family tree so insular, it was less a tree and more of a wreath. Their wealth was quieter, their influence more subtle, built on generations of trust, endowments, and unspoken power. And like many of those families, their history was a carefully guarded fortress. I started with a call to Eleanor's cousin, a woman named Beatrice residing in a sprawling, slightly neglected estate in the Berkshires. Beatrice was the family's forgotten branch, a spinster in her late 70s who had been deemed too eccentric for the Boston social scene decades ago. In my experience, the eccentrics are always the best keepers of secrets. "Richard," she said, her voice a reedy whisper over the phone. "How unexpected. Is everything quite all right with Eleanor?" "Everything is fine, Beatrice," I lied smoothly. "I'm working on a sort of family history project for Leo, a gift for his 18th birthday. I was hoping you might have some old letters, perhaps some memories of your aunt, Eleanor's mother." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Ah, Beatrice finally said, the single syllable heavy with meaning. Catherine Preston, a formidable woman. Cold as a January morning on the Charles River. A week later, a heavy, dust-scented box arrived at my office. It was filled with brittle, yellowed letters, tied in faded silk ribbons. They were mostly correspondence between Eleanor, his mother, Catherine, and her sister. I spent 2 nights in my locked study, a bottle of Macallan at my elbow, piecing together the psychological blueprint of my wife. The letters painted a chilling portrait. Catherine Preston was a woman who viewed emotion as a pathology. Love was a transaction. Affection was a weakness to be exploited. Children were not to be nurtured, they were to be molded. Assets to be polished and deployed to enhance the family standing. In one letter, dated the summer Eleanor was 9, Catherine wrote, Eleanor had another one of her episodes today. Cried for an hour because her pony threw a shoe. I informed her that a Preston does not weep over livestock. Control is the only virtue of any real consequence. In another, Catherine described a teenage Eleanor's first real crush. She has developed a rather unseemly attachment to the Cabot boy. I have explained to her that such public displays of feeling are common. She will learn to sublimate these urges into more productive channels. Duty, not desire, is the engine of a successful life. Sublimate. The word leapt off the page. Eleanor hadn't been taught to love. She had been taught that love was a dangerous, messy impulse that must be suppressed and redirected. She had been raised in an emotional desert, starved of the one thing she craved. The final piece of the puzzle came from a different source. A retired partner from my own firm, a man who had handled the Preston family's affairs for years. I invited him to lunch at the Union Club, a place where secrets are traded as readily as stock tips. Over lobster bisque, I gently probed, framing my questions as idle curiosity about my wife's family. He told me a story I had never heard. When Eleanor was 20, a year before I met her, she had been engaged to a young man, a promising banker. It was, by all accounts, a genuine love match. 2 weeks before the wedding, he broke it off. He told her, according to the club gossip my old partner recounted, that he couldn't marry into a family that felt like a beautifully furnished mausoleum. He found her inability to express genuine, unguarded emotion suffocating. She was publicly humiliated. For a Preston, it was a fate worse than death. Her mother's reaction, as my partner recalled hearing, was not of comfort, but of cold fury. "I told you," Catherine had supposedly said to her weeping daughter, "that love is a trap for fools." It all clicked into place. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. Eleanor, raised by a woman who equated affection with weakness, had one chance at real, reciprocated love, and it was snatched away. The lesson she must have learned was devastating. Her mother was right. Love was unsafe. Vulnerability was a liability. The only way to ensure you are never abandoned is to control completely and utterly the object of your affection. She couldn't do that with me. I was my own man when we met, but William was a blank slate. He was hers from birth. He would be the one thing in her life that would never leave her. The one person she could bind to herself so tightly that escape was impossible. He became the sole repository for a lifetime of dammed up, twisted, and untaught love. It was a love that didn't know how to nurture. It only knew how to possess. A love so desperate and starved that, in a moment of catastrophic weakness and moral failure, it had transgressed the most sacred of boundaries. This didn't excuse her. It didn't absolve her. There is no justification for the abyss she had dragged her own son into, but it explained the pathology. It gave a name to the disease. She was not just a monster. She was a creation, forged in the cold, loveless crucible of the Preston family. She had become a creature who could only replicate the emotional devastation that had been inflicted upon her. And in my quest for understanding, I found a sliver of something that felt like pity. It was a fleeting, unwelcome emotion, and I quickly extinguished it. Pity was a luxury I could not afford. Pity would not protect Amelia. Pity would not save Leo. Understanding was a tool for strategy, not a plea for clemency. I now knew the enemy, and I knew her weakness, the terror of abandonment that had governed her entire life. It would be the very weapon I would use to dismantle her. My investigation had focused on the perpetrators. Now, I had to turn my attention to the primary victim, not William, who was both victim and accomplice, but Amelia. I had observed her from a distance, a figure of silent, graceful suffering. But to build my case, not a legal one, but a moral one, I needed her testimony. I needed to understand the precise mechanics of the psychological warfare Eleanor had waged against her. I asked her to lunch, not at home, not at the club, but at a neutral venue, a quiet, elegant restaurant in the South End with a secluded courtyard garden. I wanted a space where she would feel safe, far from the oppressive atmosphere of the Hale residence. When she arrived, I was struck by how diminished she seemed. The bright, confident young woman I'd met 3 years ago was gone. In her place was a pale, anxious creature with dark circles under her eyes, who clutched her purse like a shield. She looked like a refugee. We ordered, making the kind of stilted small talk that fills an uncomfortable silence. I asked about her parents, her friends. Her answers were vague, disconnected. She was a ghost at the table. Finally, after the waiter had served our salads and retreated, I put down my fork. "Amelia," I began, my voice softer than I had intended, "I want to apologize." She looked up, startled. "For what, Richard?" "For my blindness," I said, meeting her gaze directly. "I have been a passive observer in my own home. I have seen your distress, and I have done nothing. That is an abdication of my responsibility, both as your father-in-law and simply as a decent human being. And for that, I am truly sorry." For a moment, she just stared at me. Then her carefully constructed composure shattered. Her lower lip began to tremble and a single tear traced a path down her cheek. She quickly brushed it away, embarrassed. "It's not your fault," she whispered. "It's me. I'm just not cut out for this. I'm not a good mother." The words were a punch to the gut. They were not her own. They were Eleanor's, planted in her mind like a poison seed. "Who told you that?" I asked gently. "Eleanor says... She says I have postpartum depression, that I'm too anxious, that I'm smothering him when I just want to hold him. She says I don't produce enough milk, that he prefers the bottle she gives him. She convinced William. He agrees with her. He thinks I need to rest and recover while she takes care of everything." She took a ragged breath. "Maybe they're right. When I hear him cry from the other wing of the house, my first instinct is to run to him. But then I stop myself. I hear her voice in my head, telling me I'll only make it worse. So I just stand there, in my room, listening to my own baby cry, The cruelty was breathtaking in its precision. Eleanor hadn't just stolen the baby. She had systematically convinced Amelia that the theft was an act of mercy, a necessary intervention to save Leo from his own mother's incompetence. She had weaponized Amelia's love for her child against her, turning her maternal instincts into a source of shame and self-doubt. "She reads my mail," Amelia added, her voice barely a whisper. "The cards and letters from my family. She told me my mother was stoking my anxiety with her constant check-ins, so she started screening them for my own good. And William allows this." Amelia just shook her head, a gesture of complete and utter defeat. "William does what his mother tells him to do. He always has. He says she's just trying to protect our family. But it doesn't feel like a family, Richard. It feels like I'm a guest. And I'm failing some test I don't even understand." I reached across the table and placed my hand over hers. Her skin was cold. "You are not failing, Amelia. You are being sabotaged. You are a wonderful mother, and Leo is lucky to have you. What is happening in our house is not normal, and it is not your fault." She looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of the old fire in her eyes, a spark of defiance that hadn't been completely extinguished. "You believe me?" "I do," I said, my voice firm. "I believe you completely, and I am going to put a stop to it." Her expression shifted from hope to fear. "But how? She's so powerful. She has William convinced of everything. He won't listen to me. He'll never stand up to her." "He won't have to," I said, a cold certainty hardening my voice. "This is no longer a matter for William to resolve. This is a matter for me." For the rest of the lunch, I steered the conversation to safer topics. I asked her about her master's degree in art history, a passion she had abandoned when she married into the Hale family. I watched as she spoke about it, her face lighting up, her gestures becoming more animated. I was seeing the woman she was supposed to be, the woman who had been buried alive under the weight of Eleanor's obsession. By the time we left, my resolve had crystallized into a diamond-hard point. This was no longer just about punishing the guilty or containing a monstrous secret. My mission had a new focus, a moral imperative that dwarfed all others. It was about rescue. I was going to save Amelia. I was going to give her back her life and her son. And to do that, I would have to perform a surgical, ruthless amputation on my own family. I would have to cut out the diseased parts, no matter how much it bled. There are moments that require a scalpel, and there are moments that require an axe. And then there are the moments that require a man like Arthur Graves. Arthur has been my law partner for 40 years, and my friend for longer. We met in the intellectual bloodsport of the Harvard Law Review, and have been in the trenches together ever since. Where I am cool, analytical, and strategic, Arthur is pragmatic, brutally efficient, and possesses a moral compass that, while functional, always points toward the magnetic north of victory. He is the man you call when the rules of civilized engagement no longer apply. That night, after my lunch with Amelia, I called him. My instructions were brief. "Arthur, my office, 1 hour, come alone." He arrived at 11:10. The firm was a ghost ship, the only light coming from the emergency fixtures and the soft glow of my desk lamp. Below us, Boston was a glittering circuit board of light and life, a world away from the sterile silence of our perch. Arthur entered without knocking, his trench coat draped over his arm, his face etched with the weariness of a long day. He was a man built of sharp angles and shrewd observations, with eyes that had seen the very worst of human greed and folly, and had never once flinched. "Richard," he said, his voice a low gravel, "you look like you're about to declare war or file for bankruptcy. Which is it?" "Pour yourself a drink, Arthur," I said, gesturing to the crystal decanter of scotch on the credenza. "You're going to need it." He raised an eyebrow, but did as I asked, pouring 2 fingers of the amber liquid into a heavy glass. He sat in the chair opposite me, the same one William had sweated in days before, and waited. He was a patient man. He knew I would get to the point. I didn't. I simply unlocked my desk drawer, removed the cream-colored envelope, and slid it across the vast expanse of polished mahogany. He looked at the envelope, then at me. "What's this?" "A bad medical report." "You could call it that," I said. "Read it." He put on his reading glasses, slit the envelope open with a thick finger, and unfolded the report. I watched him. I saw his eyes scan the technical data, his legal mind automatically parsing the jargon. Then I saw them lock on the summary table. His posture, usually relaxed and confident, became rigid. He leaned closer to the page, as if the proximity might change the words. He read it once, then he read it again. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the faint whisper of the HVAC system. Finally, he took off his glasses and placed them carefully on the desk. He pinched the bridge of his nose, his eyes closed. He sat that way for what must have been a full minute. When he looked up at me, the usual cynical humor in his eyes was gone. In its place was something I had never seen before, a look of profound, horrified disbelief. "Jesus Christ, Richard," he breathed. I said nothing. I just met his gaze. I had no words of comfort or explanation to offer. There were none. There was only the fact of it, sitting there on the desk between us in black and white. He pushed the report away from himself as if it were contaminated. He stood up, walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, and stared out at the city lights, his back to me. For 40 years, Arthur and I had dealt with the ugliest aspects of human nature: hostile takeovers, fraudulent bankruptcies, bitter divorces involving billions of dollars, and even the occasional criminal case in our younger days. We had seen men and women lie, cheat, steal, and betray for money, for power, for sex. We thought we had seen it all. "This is..." he started, then trailed off, searching for a word. He found none. He just shook his head. He turned back to face me, his expression now hardened, the shock replaced by a grim, professional focus. The fixer was back online. "What do you want to do?" "I want to remove them," I said, my voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Eleanor and William, from the house, from Amelia's life, from Leo's life, permanently." Arthur nodded slowly, his mind already working, calculating angles, assessing liabilities. A messy divorce is one thing. This is biblical. The press would have a field day. It would destroy the firm. It would destroy the Hale name for generations. "Which is why it cannot be a fight," I stated. "It must be a procedure, a clean excision, no scandal, no public mess. They will simply disappear." He came back to the desk, his focus absolute. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw the war strategist emerge. "Then this is not a family problem, Richard," he said, his voice low and firm. "Forget they are your wife and son. They are compromised assets that pose a catastrophic threat to the entire enterprise. This is an asset extraction, and the primary assets to be protected are the girl and the child. His words were like a splash of ice water, brutal and clarifying. He was right. He had given me the framework I needed. This wasn't about a husband's betrayal or a father's grief. This was an operation. For the next 2 hours, we worked. We sat under the single cone of light from my desk lamp, our voices low, the city sleeping below us, and we designed the perfect, inescapable trap. It had 3 core components. First, financial leverage. We would draw up 2 sets of documents. One, an ironclad divorce settlement for Eleanor. It would be generous enough to allow her a comfortable life, but contingent upon a permanent non-disclosure agreement and her immediate permanent relocation out of state. The second, a restructuring of William's trust, effectively cutting him off from the family fortune unless he agreed to our terms. A complete surrender of his parental rights to Amelia and his own relocation with his mother. Second, the threat of exposure. We would make no overt threats, but the DNA report itself, a copy of which would be present, would be the silent gun on the table. Its existence would imply the possibility of its release. For Eleanor, a woman pathologically obsessed with her social standing, public disgrace was a more potent threat than financial ruin. Third, the psychological component. The confrontation had to be swift, controlled, and final. It would take place on my territory, in our home, but on my terms. Arthur would be present, not as a friend, but as legal counsel, his presence professionalizing the encounter and stripping it of its familial context. It would not be a screaming match. It would be a surrender. By 2 a.m., we had a plan. A blueprint for the demolition and reconstruction of my life. Arthur stood to leave, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Are you sure you can do this, Richard?" he asked, his voice softer now. I looked at the plan we had outlined on a yellow legal pad. It was clean. It was logical. It was ruthless. It was the only way. "I'm not the man they think I am, Arthur," I said. "They are about to find that out." He nodded once, then left me alone in the silent office. I stared at the DNA report. There would be no trial, no jury, just a verdict delivered by me, and the sentence was exile. The invitation was delivered via email, a medium I chose for its cold, impersonal efficiency. The subject line was simply, "Family Matters." The body was concise. "A family dinner will be held in the main dining room this evening at 7 o'clock. Formal attire. We have important matters to discuss regarding the family's future." It was a summons, not an invitation, and it was obeyed. By 6:45, the house was filled with a tense, expectant energy. I stood in the library, adjusting my tie in the reflection of a framed map of 19th century Boston, and listened to the sounds. The rustle of Eleanor's silk dress as she descended the main staircase. William's nervous cough from the living room. Amelia's soft, hesitant footsteps in the hall. They were all moving toward the dining room, the stage I had set for the final act. When I entered, they were already seated. The room was a monument to the Hale legacy. The long mahogany table was polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the crystal glasses and the heavy ancestral silver. The portraits of my forefathers stared down from the walls, their painted eyes stern and judgmental. For the first time, I felt a kinship with their severity. Eleanor was radiant, a queen holding court. She had misinterpreted the purpose of this dinner entirely. In her mind, this was her coronation. This was the night I would finally acknowledge her complete control over William's branch of the family, perhaps even announce a transfer of some new responsibility to him. A responsibility she would, of course, manage. She wore a deep emerald gown and the Preston diamonds. It was armor for a victory she believed was already won. William sat to her right, looking pale and uncomfortable in his suit. He kept glancing at his mother for cues, a marionette waiting for the pull of a string. Amelia sat opposite him, a small, fragile bird in a simple navy dress. She looked terrified. I had spoken to her that afternoon, a brief, private conversation. I told her only this: "Tonight I am resolving the situation. I need you to be present, and I need you to trust me no matter what happens." She had nodded, her eyes wide, but I knew she couldn't possibly comprehend the scale of the resolution I had planned. I took my seat at the head of the table. The meal was served with the silent, flawless precision of our long-serving staff. The courses came and went: seared scallops, consommé, roast lamb. The food was exquisite, but to me, it tasted of nothing. The clinking of silverware on the Royal Doulton china sounded unnaturally loud in the strained silence. Eleanor attempted to fill the void with chatter about a recent charity gala, about the symphony's new conductor. It was a monologue. I responded in polite, clipped monosyllables. William said nothing. Amelia looked as if she might break if a single word were directed at her. I was not dining with my family. I was observing the subjects of an impending, hostile intervention. I watched Eleanor's smug confidence, the proprietary way she would direct a comment to William. I watched William's averted, haunted gaze. I watched Amelia's trembling hands in her lap. I was committing the last moments of this fiction to memory. This was the final, preserved state of the lie before its dissection. When the dessert plates were cleared, I placed my napkin on the table. The gesture was a signal. The performance was over. "If you would all join me in the library," I said, my voice leaving no room for discussion. Eleanor's smile was triumphant. The library was my domain, the seat of power. An invitation there meant the real business was about to begin. She rose, expecting to witness the anointing of her son. I arranged them as I had planned. I took my position behind my large, imposing desk. I gestured for Eleanor and William to take the two leather client chairs facing me. They sat, a queen and her prince, ready to receive their new dominion. I directed Amelia to a softer armchair by the fireplace, slightly to the side. Out of the direct line of fire, a protected party. "Richard, this is all very dramatic," Eleanor said, a hint of amused impatience in her tone. "What is this about?" Before I could answer, the deep, resonant chime of the doorbell echoed through the house. Eleanor frowned. "Are we expecting someone?" "Yes," I said calmly. "I am." A moment later, our butler Thomas appeared at the library door. "Mr. Arthur Graves is here, sir." "Send him in, Thomas, thank you." Eleanor's expression shifted from amusement to confusion, then to a flicker of annoyance. Arthur's presence changed the context. This was no longer just a family meeting. Arthur entered. He was not dressed as a friend paying a social call. He wore a severe, dark gray suit and carried a polished leather briefcase. He looked like what he was, a senior partner arriving for a critical, high-stakes negotiation. He gave a curt, professional nod in my direction and ignored everyone else. He took a position standing just behind and to the right of my desk, a silent, imposing sentinel. Arthur, Eleanor said, her voice tight with forced pleasantry. What a surprise. We weren't aware this was a business meeting. That, I said, my voice dropping to the cool, measured tone of the courtroom, is because you have misapprehended the nature of this gathering. I leaned forward, placing my folded hands on the empty surface of my desk. I looked directly at my wife and my son. The prosecutor was now in session. This is not a family discussion. This is a formal meeting to address certain irreconcilable issues. I paused, letting the cold, legalistic words sink in. Arthur is here in his professional capacity as my legal counsel, and we are here tonight to discuss the terms of your separation from this family, effective immediately. The air in the library grew thick and cold, as if the temperature had dropped 20 degrees in an instant. Eleanor's face, moments before a mask of smug triumph, now registered a flicker of confusion, then outrage. Separation, she repeated, the word a sharp, incredulous hiss. Richard, what on earth are you talking about? Have you been drinking? I ignored her. My gaze shifted to William. He looked like a cornered animal, darting glances between me, his mother, and the silent, statuesque figure of Arthur Graves. He was already drowning. From his briefcase, Arthur produced 2 thick document-bound folders. He placed them on my desk with a soft, definitive thud. The sound seemed to echo in the cavernous silence of the room. I took the first folder, its cover a stark manila, and slid it across the polished mahogany toward Eleanor. This is a post-nuptial settlement agreement, I stated, my voice as flat and hard as the wood of the desk. It outlines the terms of our divorce. You will find them to be, under the circumstances, exceedingly generous. You will be provided with a trust that will generate an income sufficient for you to live in the manner to which you have become accustomed. You will retain ownership of the apartment in Paris and the art collection we acquired together. All other joint assets, including this house, will revert to me. Eleanor stared at the folder as if it were a venomous snake. She didn't touch it. This is insane, she spat, her voice rising. A divorce? On what grounds? There are no grounds. This is our home. This is my family. The grounds, I said, my voice dropping lower, colder, are incontrovertible and not subject to negotiation. The agreement is also contingent upon 2 very important clauses. First, you will sign a non-disclosure and non-disparagement agreement, so comprehensive that you will be in breach if you so much as mention the Hale name to a new acquaintance. Second, you will relocate from the state of Massachusetts within 30 days. Permanently. All contact with this family in any form will cease. I then picked up the second folder and slid it toward my son. William, this document is for you. It's an irrevocable amendment to your trust and a petition for the voluntary relinquishment of parental rights. His head snapped up, his eyes wide with panic. You will cede full, sole, and uncontested legal and physical custody of Leo to his mother, Amelia. You will waive all rights to visitation. In exchange, the amended trust will provide you with a modest but livable annual stipend. You will, of course, be required to relocate with your mother. It was then that Eleanor finally exploded. She shot to her feet, her face a mask of incandescent rage. "How dare you!" she shrieked, the carefully constructed facade of the Boston Brahmin shattering into 1,000 pieces. "How dare you walk in here and try to dismantle my life, to take my son and my grandson away from me? You have no right. William, tell him. Tell your father he has gone mad." All eyes turned to William. He was trembling, his face ashen. He opened his mouth, but only a choked, pathetic sound came out. He looked at his mother's furious, expectant face, then at my own implacable one. He was a man being torn in two. Father, I don't understand, he stammered. What have I done? That was my cue. This was the moment of maximum resistance, the point where I had to crush their defiance completely and irrevocably. My movements were slow, deliberate. I reached into my desk drawer, the same one where I had first locked away the report. I pulled out a third folder. This one was slim, containing only a few sheets of paper. It was a copy. The original was in a safe deposit box at Arthur S. Bank. I didn't slide this one. I placed it gently in the center of the desk, equidistant from them both. You speak of rights, I said, my voice now a quiet, lethal whisper. You speak of madness. Let's talk about facts instead. I have spent my entire life dealing in verifiable, empirical facts. And this, I tapped a single finger on the folder, is the most verifiable fact I have ever encountered. Eleanor stared at the folder, a dawning horror in her eyes. She knew. In that instant, she knew what it was. Her rage faltered, replaced by a wave of pure animal panic. I suggest you read it, I said. Both of you, before you say another word. With a trembling hand, William reached out and opened the folder. He read the first page. I watched the color drain from his face, his eyes widening in disbelief, then shame, then utter despair. He looked up at his mother, his expression one of a child who has just witnessed a murder. Eleanor snatched the papers from his hand. Her eyes flew across the page, scanning the clinical, damning prose, the probabilities, the chromosomal data, the conclusion, stated in language that no amount of social influence or legal maneuvering could ever refute. The change was terrifying to behold. It was not a gradual crumbling, it was a total, instantaneous collapse. The rage, the defiance, the pride, all of it vanished, as if a switch had been flipped. Her body seemed to shrink in on itself. She sank back into her chair, the papers slipping from her nerveless fingers and scattering on the floor. Her face was a ruin. The queen was deposed. Her armor pierced. Her kingdom turned to ash. Silence. The only sound in the room was the soft, ragged breathing of Amelia, who was staring at the scene, her hand over her mouth, a slow, horrified understanding dawning on her face. She didn't know the specifics, but she knew she was witnessing the detonation of a secret so profound it had broken the people in front of her. The documents are on the desk, I said into the void. You will sign them tonight. Arthur has brought a notary. He's waiting in the hall. If you refuse, a copy of that report will be delivered to the board of every charity you sit on, to every friend you have, and to the Boston Globe by morning. The choice is yours. A quiet, comfortable exile, or an inferno. Eleanor didn't look up. She just stared at the floor, at the scattered pages that contained the obliteration of her life. The game was over. I had won. There was no final dramatic confrontation. There were no tears, no recriminations, no pleas for mercy. The signing of the documents was a dead, airless affair conducted under the cold, professional gaze of Arthur's notary. Eleanor's signature was a spidery, broken thing, the elegant flourish she was known for reduced to a palsied scrawl. William signed as if in a trance, his hand moving across the page with the lifeless obedience of an automaton. Within 48 hours, they were gone. They packed in silence, moving through the rooms of the house like ghosts haunting the scene of their own demise. Staff were instructed to assist them with a detached, professional courtesy. I remained in my study, the door closed, a silent, unseen observer of the exodus I had orchestrated. I heard the sound of suitcases being carried down the grand staircase, the soft closing of doors, the low murmur of the driver I had hired. Then, the final sound, the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway as a single black town car pulled away, disappearing down the tree-lined street. And then, nothing. A profound, unnatural silence descended upon the house. It was a silence I had craved for months, but now that it was here, it was not peaceful. It was cavernous, hollow. The house, which had once felt like a fortress, now felt like a mausoleum. For the rest of that day, I walked its empty halls. I was the curator of a failed museum. I stood in the music room, staring at the grand piano Eleanor would no longer play. I passed William's old bedroom, a shrine to a boyhood that had curdled into a tragic manhood. Every object, every portrait, every polished surface was a testament to a life that had been a lie. My victory was absolute, but it brought no triumph. There is no joy in amputating your own limbs, even to save your life. There is only the shock of the loss and the phantom ache of what used to be. Late that afternoon, I found Amelia. She was where I knew she would be, in the nursery. The door was ajar. She was sitting in the rocking chair, not rocking, just holding Leo against her chest. He was asleep, his small face a portrait of perfect peace, oblivious to the cataclysm that had just reshaped his world. Amelia was not crying. She was just staring out the window at the late afternoon sun slanting through the ancient elms, her expression one of exhausted, disbelieving calm. I stood in the doorway, and she looked up, her eyes meeting mine. There was no fear in them now, just a deep, profound weariness. I stepped into the room, my footsteps unnaturally loud on the hardwood floor. I stopped a few feet away from her. The words I had rehearsed felt inadequate, clumsy. "I am sorry, Amelia," I said, my voice quiet. "For my part in this, for not seeing, for not acting sooner, for allowing this house to become your prison." She looked down at her sleeping son, her fingers gently stroking his fine hair. "You didn't know," she whispered. "It wasn't an absolution, just a statement of fact." "I should have," I countered. "A man should know what happens under his own roof. I chose not to." She was silent for a long moment, then took a deep, shuddering breath. It was the sound of a body releasing a tension it has held for a year. A tear finally escaped and rolled down her cheek, but it was a tear of release, not of grief. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely audible. This was the most critical moment. This was where I proved that my actions were about liberation, not a simple transfer of power from Eleanor to myself. "That is entirely up to you," I said, my voice firm and clear. "I have destroyed your life as it was. I feel it is my duty to help you build a new one, on your terms, so I am giving you a choice." I took a step closer. "Choice 1, you leave, you and Leo. You can go anywhere in the world you want to go. New York, California, London, Paris. I will set up a trust for you, untouchable in your name only, that will ensure you and he are financially secure for the rest of your lives. You would never have to see another Hale again. You can start over completely and totally free of this family and its history. I will make all the arrangements. You would only have to say the word." She looked at me, processing the magnitude of the offer of a complete escape. "And choice two?" she asked. "You stay," I said. "Here. For now, or for as long as you wish. This house is large enough. We can give you your own space, your own life within it. You can finish your degree. You can raise your son in the only home he's ever known. If you choose this, I will make you a promise. I will never try to be a father to Leo. That role has been corrupted. But I will do my damnedest to be the best grandfather a boy could ever ask for. I will offer my support, my protection, but I will never again offer my authority. Your life will be your own." I let the two choices hang in the air between us. One was an exit. The other was a new beginning, built upon the ruins of the old. Both, I hoped, were a form of freedom. She looked from my face to the face of her sleeping child, her expression unreadable. She was no longer the frightened girl I'd taken to lunch. She was a mother, a survivor weighing the future of her son. "I need to think," she said finally. "Of course," I replied. "Take all the time you need." I nodded once and retreated from the room, leaving her alone with her son and her choice. I had razed the old world to the ground. Now it was up to her to decide if she wanted to help me build a new one on the ashes. The year that followed was one of quiet reconstruction. It was like living on a historic battlefield after the cannons have fallen silent. The ground is scarred, the air still smells of smoke, but here and there, small green shoots begin to push their way through the scorched earth. Amelia chose to stay. It was not a decision she made quickly. For a week, the house remained in a state of suspended animation. Then, one morning, she found me in the garden. She had Leo strapped to her chest in a carrier, and for the first time in my memory, she looked rested. The deep, bruised shadows under her eyes had begun to fade. "I want to stay, Richard," she said, her voice clear and steady. "But not in their rooms. I'd like to move into the East Wing. And I'm re-enrolling at Harvard for the spring semester to finish my master's." It was not a request. It was a statement of intent, a declaration of independence. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in that house. "Excellent," I said, a genuine smile touching my lips for what felt like the first time in an age. "I'll have the staff begin the arrangements immediately." The transformation of the house was slow but profound. It was a process of exorcism. Amelia, with a quiet determination that amazed me, began to reclaim the space. She packed away Eleanor's heavy, oppressive decor, the dark velvets, the severe antiques, and replaced them with lighter colors, modern art, and shelves filled not with leather-bound legal texts, but with books on Italian art and children's stories. The oppressive silence was gradually replaced by new sounds. The melodies of a baby monitor, the murmur of a television playing cartoons, and eventually, the glorious, liberating sound of a child, its laughter echoing in the halls. I kept my promise. I stepped back. I gave her space, autonomy. I was no longer the patriarch of a dynasty. I was a tenant in a house that was slowly becoming a home. My role was redefined. I was a driver for doctor's appointments, a consultant on the best local parks for a toddler, a willing babysitter whenever Amelia had a late-night study session. I also began my own retreat. I called Arthur and informed him I was stepping down as managing partner of the firm. I would retain a title, senior counsel, but my active days were over. The fight had gone out of me. The thrill of the boardroom, the intellectual chess of a high-stakes negotiation. It all seemed pointless. A game played by men in expensive suits, moving abstract sums of money around a meaningless board. My world had shrunk to the four walls of this house and the small, growing boy within them. My project was no longer Hale and Graves. It was Leo. I discovered a part of myself I never knew existed. I, Richard Hale, who had once cross-examined hostile witnesses into submission, found myself on the floor of the living room, patiently demonstrating how to stack one wooden block on top of another. I, who had drafted billion-dollar merger agreements, now spent my afternoons reading Goodnight Moon, perfecting the voices of the little old lady whispering hush and the quiet mouse. He was a happy child, bright, curious, and blissfully unaware of the twisted genetics that flowed through his veins. To him, I was simply Gramps, a man with a scratchy beard who gave the best horsey-back rides and always had a biscuit hidden in his pocket. In him, I saw a chance for a different kind of legacy. The Hale dynasty, with its obsession with power, bloodlines, and public perception, was a corrupt and hollow thing. It had produced a broken son and a monstrous secret. It was a legacy of ruin. But with Leo, there was a chance to build something else, something smaller, quieter, and infinitely more real. A legacy built not on a name, but on love. A love born not of obligation or possession, but of choice. A love that had grown out of the ashes of an unspeakable lie. One crisp autumn afternoon, Amelia came into the library where I was reading. Leo was at a toddler and me art class. She had a university course catalog in her hand and a radiant smile on her face. She was thriving. The ghost was gone, replaced by a vibrant, confident woman. "Thank you, Richard," she said softly. "For what?" I asked, looking up over my spectacles. "For giving me my life back," she said. "And for this, for being a grandfather to my son." "It is I who should be thanking you, Amelia," I replied, my voice thick with an emotion that still felt foreign to me. "You and Leo have given me something to build. My old world was based on a faulty foundation. It was bound to collapse. We were two survivors, a young woman and an old man, building a new structure on the rubble of our shared past. It wasn't a palace. It wasn't a dynasty. It was something far more modest and infinitely more precious. It was a family. One gray Tuesday in November, nearly 2 years after the Exodus, a piece of mail arrived that was not a bill or a magazine. It was a simple, plain postcard, the kind you buy in a train station kiosk. The postmark was smudged, but I could make out Zurich. The picture on the front was of a placid blue lake surrounded by snow-capped mountains, a world of serene, cold beauty. I turned it over. There was no return address. The message was written in a spidery, almost unreadable scrawl, the handwriting of someone unsteady, or perhaps just unaccustomed to holding a pen. It was William O's. There were only 3 words. "I am sorry." I stared at the postcard for a long time, standing there in the grand foyer of my home. I am sorry. For what? For the act itself. For his weakness. For the destruction. For everything. The words were a pathetic, inadequate echo from a distant, severed world. An attempt at an apology that could never be accepted because the crime was beyond forgiveness. Did I feel pity for him? Perhaps a sliver. He was as much a product of Eleanor's pathology as he was a participant in it. A boy who was never allowed to become a man, whose will had been systematically eroded until there was nothing left but a hollow shell, filled with his mother's desires. But pity is not absolution. His sorrow, whatever its depth, could not undo the damage. It was a ghost, knocking at a door that would forever remain closed. I walked into the library. The fire was roaring in the hearth, a bulwark against the November chill. Leo was napping upstairs. Amelia was at the university library, researching a paper on Renaissance patronage. The house was quiet. I held the postcard to the flames. The glossy image of the lake curled, blackened, and turned to ash. The words of my son, the last I would ever receive from him, vanished into the heat. The past could not be erased, but it did not have to be entertained. It belonged in the fire. Later that afternoon, Leo woke up from his nap. He came toddling into the library, his face still flushed with sleep, dragging a large, colorful picture book behind him. He climbed into my lap, settled himself against my chest, and pushed the book into my hands. "Book, Gramps," he demanded, his small voice full of toddler authority. I opened the book. It was one of his favorites, a simple story about a bear searching for the perfect home. I began to read, my voice a low, steady rumble. He listened, his head resting on my shoulder, his small, warm body a solid, comforting weight against mine. Outside, the wind howled, and the last of the autumn leaves were stripped from the trees. But inside the library, in the warm glow of the fire, a new world was being built. One word, one page, one shared moment at a time. I looked down at the top of his head, at the whirl of dark hair so much like my own, so much like his father's. There was no escaping genetics. But a name, a bloodline, that is not a destiny. It is just a starting point. The rest is a choice. The Hale dynasty was dead. Its magnificent, rotting edifice had been razed to the ground. And thank God for that. In its place, on its ruins, I would build something that could last. Something true. Even if it had cost me everything I once thought was my world.